Somewhere on the gun deck of an 18th-century warship, wedged between coiled rope and iron cannon, sits a barrel. It is heavy enough that 4 men are needed to roll it into position. The oak staves are dark with age and salt spray, and the smell coming off it is warm and sharp and unmistakably sweet. Around it, sailors are already lining up, tin cups in hand, moving with the practiced patience of men who have learned that some things in this life are worth waiting for quietly. That barrel is where this story begins. Rum is one of those substances that history keeps returning to, not simply because people enjoyed drinking it, though they certainly did, but because it sat at the crossroads of almost every great force shaping the Atlantic world for 3 centuries. Naval power, colonial ambition, the brutal machinery of the plantation system, piracy, parliamentary debate, revolution, and eventually a kind of quiet mourning when it was finally taken away. Few objects as simple as a wooden cask have carried so much of the world inside them. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet, now. The question this video wants to answer is not just what rum is or how it was made, though we will get to both. The real question is how a single spirit became so deeply threaded into the fabric of empire that removing it from the Royal Navy more than 300 years after it was first issued required an Act of Parliament and left grown men weeping on ships. The journey to answer that takes us across a remarkable amount of territory. We will go to the sugar islands of the Caribbean, where cane fields stretched to the horizon, and a thick, dark byproduct called molasses turned out to be worth almost as much as the sugar itself. We will follow the rum barrel onto naval vessels provisioning fleets in the tropics, where beer spoiled in the heat and French brandy was never going to be enough. We will meet an admiral named Robert Blake, who in 1650 first put fortified spirits on the official naval supply list, and we will see how 5 years later, after English forces seized Jamaica, the practical calculus of equipping a fleet in the West Indies changed everything. We will follow that barrel into the hands of pirates operating out of Port Royal, a city so spectacular in its lawlessness that historians still struggle to describe it with a straight face. We will see how rum crossed the Atlantic as currency, as cargo, as a link in a trade network so vast and so morally catastrophic that it helped finance the forced transport of millions of enslaved Africans. We will trace the anger that built in the American colonies when the British Parliament tried to tax the molasses feeding the New England rum trade, and we will notice the thread connecting that anger to revolution. We will sit with a man named Admiral Edward Vernon, who in 1740 looked at his sailors drinking half a pint of neat rum twice a day and decided that some adjustments were in order. We will spend time with the legends, the sea stories, the myths of cursed barrels and floating admirals and cups passed in the dark below decks. And then we will arrive at the 31st of July, 1970, a date that Royal Navy sailors called Black Tot Day, when the last official rum ration was poured and a tradition that had outlasted the age of sail, the age of steam, and 2 world wars finally ended. After that, we will look at what survived, because something always does. A few things are worth saying honestly at the start. The history of rum is not always clean, and neither are the sources. The precise origin of the naval rum ration is one of those points where historians still disagree. Some accounts anchor it to Blake's 1650 decree. Others argue the real turning point was 1655, when Jamaica was taken and local cane spirits simply proved more practical than anything else on offer. The exact ration volumes changed over time, differed by rank, and were recorded differently in different ships' logs. Where those uncertainties exist, this video will name them rather than paper over them with false precision. What is not disputed is the broader arc. Rum was at the start a solution to a practical problem. Ships needed to carry provisions that would not rot in tropical heat. Beer spoiled. Wine was expensive and fragile. Rum could be stored indefinitely, took up far less space per unit of strength than beer, and arrived already abundant in the Caribbean at exactly the moment the Royal Navy needed to maintain a permanent presence there. It was, by every logistical measure, the sensible choice. But practical supply items do not usually reshape the Atlantic world. They do not usually inspire legends, fuel revolutions, fund piracy, underwrite slavery, and end with parliamentary mourning 3 centuries later. Rum did all of those things because it was never just a supply item. It was a mirror held up to empire, reflecting back everything the empire wanted and everything it was willing to do to get it. That barrel on the deck was not just storing liquid, it was storing history. And there is a great deal of that history still left to open. To understand why rum exists at all, you have to stand in a cane field. Picture the Caribbean in the 17th century. Islands arranged like stepping stones across warm water, wrapped in a climate that practically insists on agriculture. Temperatures running between 22 and 30 degrees year-round. Rainfall heavy enough and regular enough to sustain continuous growth. Soils volcanic and deep. It was, from a purely agricultural standpoint, some of the most productive land on Earth. And once European planters recognized that fact, they bent the entire landscape toward a single crop, sugarcane. By the height of the plantation era, the British West Indies was supplying somewhere between 80 and 90% of all the sugar consumed in Western Europe. Between 1766 and 1791 alone, the islands produced over 1 million tons of it. These were not small garden operations, they were industrial systems, with the cane fields stretching to the horizon and the boiling houses running through the night. Contemporary observers noted the obvious without softening it. Without enslaved African labour, they wrote, none of this was possible. The sugar economy was built entirely on that force system. Without it, there would have been no sugar, and, as we will see, no rum. The sugar-making process was hot, precise, and relentless. Cane was cut and crushed to extract the juice. That juice was boiled down through a series of progressively smaller copper kettles, each one concentrating the liquid further until sugar crystals began to form. Those crystals were packed into barrels and left to drain. And what drained out, the thick, dark, slow-moving liquid that the sugar would not hold on to no matter how long you waited, was molasses. Molasses was, in the strict accounting of the plantation, a residue, a low-value byproduct. It could not be refined further into useful sugar without significant additional effort, and it was not appealing enough to sell as food on its own. Planters stored it in large cisterns, traded it cheaply, sometimes simply let it accumulate. For a long time it was the part of sugar production that nobody had a very good answer for, until someone decided to ferment it. The exact moment is difficult to pin down, but by around 1650, records from Barbados begin describing a distilled spirit made from fermented cane juice and molasses. The early names for it were telling: Kill Devil, Rumbullion. These were not names given to something refined or elegant. They were names given to something powerful and a little alarming, a spirit that hit hard and cost almost nothing to produce because it was made from material that would otherwise go to waste. By 1667, the name had shortened to rum, and the product had spread across the islands. The chemistry was simple enough. Dilute the molasses, roughly 1 part molasses to 8 parts water, add a fermenting agent, let it work, then distill. The result was a spirit that could reach 140 proof. The economics were even more striking. Molasses that had almost no value sitting in a cistern became, once distilled, a commodity worth far more than the raw material it came from. The transformation was not complicated. It just required someone to recognize that the waste product was not actually waste. What matters about the origin of rum is the social register it came from. This was not a spirit invented by aristocrats or crafted in monasteries by monks with centuries of technique behind them. Rum was not wine. It was not brandy. It emerged from the practical mathematics of the plantation, born from a byproduct, distilled in rough conditions by people working out what could be salvaged from what was left over. It began as a solution to a surplus problem, and it grew from there because the conditions for growing it were everywhere in the Caribbean, and the demand for strong, storable, cheap spirits was everywhere else. Geography did the rest. The islands were already positioned along the most heavily travelled shipping routes in the Atlantic world. Sugar was going east toward Europe. Ships were coming west with manufactured goods, and, catastrophically, with human cargo. Molasses and rum moved in both directions, linking plantation output to colonial economies in ways that would compound for the next 2 centuries. None of this was elegant at the start. The boiling houses smelled of burned sugar and wood smoke. The molasses cisterns attracted insects and heat. The first distilleries were rough structures built close to the plantation works. But out of that rough practical system came a spirit that would travel further, mean more, and last longer than anyone standing in those early Barbadian cane fields could possibly have imagined. The barrel had been filled. Now it needed somewhere to go. The barrel needed a market. and as it turned out, one of the largest and most reliable markets in the Atlantic world was floating just offshore. The Royal Navy in the mid-17th century was an institution with a serious drinking problem, not in the sense of dysfunction, but in the sense of logistics. Every ship that left an English port carried an obligation to its crew, a daily ration of something alcoholic. This was not indulgence, it was necessity. Fresh water stored in wooden casks turned green and foul within weeks at sea. Beer was the traditional solution, and for centuries it worked reasonably well in northern waters. A sailor was entitled to a gallon of beer per day, which sounds extraordinary until you understand that the beer was weak, often barely fermented, and primarily valued because the alcohol content was just enough to retard bacterial growth. It kept the water drinkable by making it something other than water. In English seas, in the grey cold of the North Atlantic, this arrangement held together, but push a fleet south, into the tropics, and everything changed. Heat accelerated the very processes that alcohol was supposed to prevent. Beer soured faster than anyone could drink it. Wine turned to vinegar. Contemporary complaints from sailors were blunt. Nothing, one account noted, displeased the seamen more than sour beer. In the tropics, sour beer was almost guaranteed. The provisioning logic that worked in European waters fell apart entirely once a fleet entered warm latitudes, and by the 1640s and 1650s the English were increasingly sending fleets into exactly those warm latitudes. It was against this backdrop that Admiral Robert Blake enters the record. Blake was one of the most capable naval commanders England ever produced, a man who understood both the politics of sea power and the grinding practicalities of keeping men healthy enough to fight. In 1650, according to records that historians have examined closely, Blake issued a fortified spirit to his fleet as a replacement for the traditional beer ration. The spirit he reached for was French brandy. It was stronger than beer, more stable, less vulnerable to the heat, and could be stored without the slow deterioration that plagued barrels of ale. By naval standards, it was a practical solution to a persistent problem, and it represents what many historians consider the first official spirit ration in the Royal Navy. But here is where the story becomes interesting in a different way, not because the facts are absent, but because the facts are contested, and the contestation reveals something true about how institutions actually change. Some historians treat Blake's 1650 brandy issuance as the definitive moment, the founding decree of the naval spirit ration, the point at which policy was set from above by a senior officer who understood what his crews needed. Others argue that 1650 was an exception, a one-off response to a specific situation, and that the real, practical, fleet-wide adoption of a daily spirit ration came 5 years later and through entirely different circumstances. The source documents sometimes list the substance as brandy, sometimes as cane spirit, sometimes with terminology that reflects the regional naming conventions of the islands rather than any standardized English nomenclature. Whether what Blake issued should be counted as the first rum ration depends on what you mean by rum, and in 1650 the definition was still being worked out. What happened in 1655 is less ambiguous in its consequences, even if the paperwork remains imprecise. Admiral William Penn led the English fleet that captured Jamaica that year, wresting the island from Spain in an operation that was only partially successful by its own ambitious goals. The intended target had been Hispaniola, but which turned out to be one of the most consequential military acquisitions in English colonial history. Jamaica was large, fertile, positioned centrally in the Caribbean, and already producing sugarcane. It would become, within decades, the most productive sugar island under English control and the single most important source of rum in the entire Atlantic world. But in 1655, in the immediate aftermath of the capture, Penn faced the same problem Blake had faced before him. His men were in the tropics, their beer was undrinkable, their water supply was unreliable. The fleet needed something that worked in this climate, and the island they had just seized happened to be producing exactly that. The local cane spirit, aguardiente de caña in the Spanish tradition that had preceded English rule, was available, abundant and cheap in a way that imported brandy from France could never be. It cost almost nothing, because it was made from the molasses that the sugar works were already generating as a byproduct. Penn's solution was not a policy document, it was a practical command. Give the men what is available and what keeps. What followed was not an immediate fleet-wide decree but something more organic, a gradual standardization of what had already become common practice. Ships operating in Caribbean waters took on rum because rum was there and rum was stable. The logistical advantages wrote themselves. A barrel of rum occupied far less space than the equivalent caloric and alcoholic value in beer. It did not sour. It did not require the same careful temperature management. In a fleet operating thousands of miles from English ports, with no reliable resupply of traditional provisions, rum solved problems that nothing else solved as neatly. So the question of whether the naval rum ration began in 1650 or 1655 is in some ways a question about which kind of history you find more convincing. The history of decrees, in which a senior officer recognises a problem and issues an order, points toward Blake and 1650. The history of necessity, in which policy crystallises around what has already become unavoidable practice, points toward Penn and the aftermath of the Jamaican capture. The honest answer is that both chronologies are probably true in different registers, and the discrepancy between them tells us something that neither date alone can communicate. Naval policy does not always emerge cleanly from a single moment of decision. Sometimes it grows from the gap between what the regulations say and what the situation demands. What is not in dispute is what rum replaced and why the replacement stuck. Beer had been a Northern European solution to a Northern European problem. It worked in cold waters on short voyages between ports where resupply was straightforward. The Caribbean invalidated almost every assumption behind it. The distances were longer, the heat was worse, the supply lines were stretched to the point of unreliability, and the traditional provisions simply could not survive the journey or the conditions. The men who sailed those routes needed something different, and the something different was growing in every field on every island they were trying to control. There is also a financial logic worth noting. Rum was not just practically superior to beer in tropical conditions, it was cheaper. Molasses, the raw material, was the least valuable product of the sugar process. It accumulated faster than anyone could sell it, and converting it into rum transformed a near-worthless byproduct into a commodity that fleets would actively seek out and pay for. The plantation economy and the naval economy found each other through rum, and once found, they became difficult to separate. By the time England had consolidated its hold on Jamaica through the 1660s and into the 1670s, the rum ration had moved from improvisation to expectation. Sailors knew what they were owed, captains knew what to requisition. The system had not been designed in any single meeting room or set down in any single document with perfect clarity. It had accumulated, the way practical solutions to urgent problems always do, through repeated application and eventual acceptance. The spirit that had started as Kill Devil in a Barbadian distillery, rough and strong and barely named, had found its way into the most powerful maritime institution in the Atlantic world, and the Atlantic world as a result would never quite be the same. What the Navy made official, the Caribbean had already made inevitable. The only real question left was how deep the habit would run, and how many centuries it would take before anyone thought to question it. Jamaica did not simply hand the Royal Navy a new drink, it handed the Royal Navy a new geography of supply, and that distinction matters more than it might first appear. When William Penn's fleet dropped anchor off the Jamaican coast in May of 1655, the operation that had put them there was already, by its own stated ambitions, a partial failure. Cromwell's western design had aimed higher. The plan had been to strike at Hispaniola, to seize one of the great jewels of the Spanish Caribbean and announce English sea power at its most aggressive. The assault on Hispaniola collapsed. The Spanish defenders held, the English forces were repulsed, and Penn found himself in the uncomfortable position of returning to Cromwell either empty-handed or with a consolation prize. He chose the consolation prize. Jamaica, lightly defended and strategically positioned, fell to the English within days. The Spanish could not hold it, and so they abandoned it, burning what they could, and fleeing into the hills with their enslaved workers, some of whom would eventually form the maroon communities that resisted English rule for decades afterward. What Penn had captured was not what he had been sent to capture, but what he had captured turned out to be something more durable, more productive, and more consequential than Hispaniola might ever have been. Jamaica sat at the centre of the Caribbean. It was large enough to sustain major agricultural operations. Its harbours were deep and sheltered. The island's interior could support cattle, provisions and timber, and its existing infrastructure, however damaged in the chaos of conquest, already included sugar works and the equipment to process cane. Within years, that infrastructure would begin to grow into something enormous. Within decades, Jamaica would become the most productive sugar island under English control in the entire Atlantic. But in 1655 the strategic logic was simpler and more immediate. Penn had a fleet to provision, men who needed feeding and watering and rationing, and a supply chain that stretched back to England across thousands of miles of open ocean. The beer that had made the crossing was already failing in the Caribbean heat. The wine was unreliable. The traditional English provisioning system had been designed for northern latitudes and short voyages, and it was visibly breaking down in exactly the conditions Penn was operating in. The island he had just seized happened to offer a solution that no English port could have provided. Locally produced cane spirit, cheap, abundant and stable, in ways that fermented grain and grape could never match this far from home. Penn's decision to supplement his sailors' rations with this local spirit was not a declaration of policy. It was a captain's calculation, or more precisely a commander-in-chief's calculation, because Penn had been appointed to lead the Jamaica station, the permanent naval command that the capture had now made necessary. That appointment matters. The Jamaica station, established in 1655 and operational until well into the 19th century, was not just a military posting. It was a logistics architecture. It meant that the Royal Navy was committing to a permanent, institutional presence in the Caribbean, with a dockyard, a command hierarchy, and a provisioning system rooted in the island itself rather than in England. And what that island produced, in quantities that only increased over the following decades, was rum. This is where logistics becomes strategy. The relationship between the Jamaica station and the broader fleet was not simply that sailors drank what was available on a particular island at a particular moment. It was that the Navy now had a fixed point in the Caribbean, a hub from which ships could be resupplied with local provisions, rather than relying on the long, slow, expensive chains running back across the Atlantic. Rum was central to that resupply because rum was what Jamaica made in abundance, and because rum solved the problems that no amount of English beer could solve at this distance. Ships arriving at Port Royal could take on fresh rum, lime and provisions, and head back into the Caribbean without waiting for a convoy from Bristol or Portsmouth to close the supply gap. The island had become part of the Navy's extended body, a port that fed and watered the fleet not from English stores but from Caribbean ones. Penn's role in this transformation is worth examining carefully, because he is often treated as a secondary figure in the larger story, a capable admiral who happened to be present at a significant moment. But his presence at Jamaica shaped the institutional relationship between the Navy and the island's economy in ways that outlasted his own command by generations. He understood the strategic value of what he had taken, even if the home government initially received news of the conquest with something less than celebration. Cromwell reportedly wept with rage that Hispaniola had been lost. Penn faced a court-martial inquiry on his return, less for the military outcome than for the political failure of the original objective. He survived the inquiry, Jamaica survived the politics, and the logistical system he established, rooted in local provisioning and local supply, proved far more resilient than either his military reputation or Cromwell's ambitions. The command structure Penn left behind was built around integration. The Jamaica station placed admirals and commodores in direct contact with the island's economic life, with the sugar estates, the distilleries, the plantation agents who controlled the movement of molasses and spirit. When ships needed victualling, the quartermaster was not writing orders to a warehouse in Southampton. He was dealing with local merchants and estate managers who had rum to sell and reasons to sell it cheaply to the Navy's enormous purchasing appetite. The Navy, in turn, had reasons to maintain good relations with the planters, because the planters' survival depended on the same sea lanes the Navy was protecting. The mutual dependency was not accidental. It was structural, baked into the geography of the station and the economics of sugar. That dependency deepened with every decade of conflict. The 7 Years' War, which placed the Royal Navy under enormous strain across multiple theatres simultaneously, demonstrated in concrete terms how essential the Caribbean stations had become. At the Jamaica station alone, the fleet in 1760 included at least 16 ships of the line, vessels like the Cambridge, the Dreadnought, and the Edinburgh, maintaining operations across hundreds of miles of sea. Supplying those ships from England would have been nearly impossible at the pace and scale that sustained Caribbean operations required. Supplying them from the island itself through the provisioning networks that had been developing since Penn's time was difficult but manageable. Rum moved through those networks as a core commodity, not an afterthought. It was rationed, recorded, inspected, and priced. It was, in the most practical sense, a military resource. The wartime expansion of the Navy's Caribbean presence had a feedback effect on the plantation economy as well. More ships meant more demand for rum. More demand meant more incentive to expand distilling operations, to convert more of the molasses byproduct into the spirit the fleet would buy. The plantation system and the naval system were not parallel economies running alongside each other by coincidence. They were interlocked mechanisms, each generating demand that the other was positioned to meet. When the Navy fought in the Caribbean, it consumed what the Caribbean produced. When the Caribbean produced more, the Navy had reason to fight harder to protect its access to the supply. This is the strategic reality that Jamaica's capture set in motion, not the romantic story of sailors discovering a new drink they happened to enjoy, but the more complicated story of an institution realizing that it had found a provisioning solution so well fitted to its operational environment that it would become structural, foundational, and eventually almost impossible to separate from the Navy's identity in the Atlantic world. By the time the 18th century was well underway, a Royal Navy captain planning a Caribbean patrol did not think of rum as a local alternative to the real ration back home. He thought of rum as the ration, the thing that kept men on their feet in the tropics, the commodity that the Jamaica station existed in part to supply, the thread connecting the distillery on the hill with the gun deck of the ship anchored below. Penn had turned a military conquest into a provisioning network. The island had done the rest. What still remained to be settled was not whether rum belonged in the Navy, but how much of it a man could reasonably survive. The question of how much rum a man could survive was not, on a working warship, a philosophical one. It was administrative. It lived in ledgers, in the precise markings of a purser's column, in the measured pour of a supply ratings ladle, and in the daily ritual that every sailor aboard a Royal Navy vessel understood as intimately as he understood the watch schedule or the angle of the sun. The rum economy that Penn's Jamaica had set in motion did not simply fill barrels and send them to sea. It generated an entire social world, a world with its own hierarchy, its own currency, its own ceremonies, and its own quiet gravity pulling at the lives of men thousands of miles from any home they had known. At the centre of that world stood the rum tub. It was not a glamorous object, a wooden vessel, iron-bound, set out on deck or in a designated space between decks at the appointed hour. But around it, every day that weather and duty allowed, gathered one of the most consistent rituals in the history of the Royal Navy. The signal came from the boatswain's mate, a call that echoed through the decks and down into the hold, and the words that accompanied it were not a casual announcement. Up spirits was a declaration, a summons, a small ceremony folded inside a larger military routine. Men knew what it meant. They had been waiting for it. The rum boatswain, a senior rating tasked specifically with managing the day's distribution, moved first. He collected the spirit from the supply rating, the man responsible for the rum store, known below decks by the cheerful nickname Jack Dusty. The name was informal, the accounting behind it was not. Jack Dusty measured with the precision of a man who understood that every fraction of an imperial pint was recorded somewhere, in ink, in a ledger that the ship's purser would examine with the careful attention of someone who had staked his professional reputation on the accuracy of its columns. From 1866 onward, the official ration was fixed at 1/8 of an imperial pint, roughly 71 millilitres, at 95.5 proof. Not approximate, not roughly. Fixed, measured, and recorded. The purser's ledger, with its notations of tot issued and water added, was one of the earliest examples of what would later be called standard costing in institutional supply management. Long before modern logistics applied the language of cost control to military provisioning, the rum ration was already subject to it. The distribution itself moved through the ship's hierarchy in a way that made the social architecture of the vessel legible to anyone watching. Petty officers were served first. Their rum came neat, undiluted, full strength, a small material acknowledgement of their rank in a world where material acknowledgements were carefully rationed along with everything else. Junior ratings received something different. Their spirit was mixed at the tub, water added in a ratio that had evolved over the decades, producing the diluted drink that the fleet had called grog since the mid-18th century. The grog was not sipped. It was consumed in one long swallow, typically after the morning's work had been done, a moment of relief that was both physical and social. Officers occupied a different position in this architecture, separated not by enthusiasm but by entitlement. Until 1881, commissioned officers retained the right to draw their spirit neat from a separate issue, a distinction that preserved, in the language of liquor, the same divisions of rank that governed every other aspect of shipboard life. Warrant officers held that privilege even longer, until 1918. The rum ration was democratic in the sense that it touched almost everyone aboard, but it was not egalitarian. It reproduced in miniature the entire social order of the vessel. The ship's books made that order permanent. Every sailor registered his preference. The letter G marked in the column beside his name meant he took the grog ration. T meant temperance, that he had declined the spirit entirely and would receive a small payment or an allowance of extra provisions instead. UA, entered beside the names of those under 20 years of age, meant he was denied it altogether, regardless of what he might have preferred. These categories were not suggestions, they were official designations, tracked across voyages and updated at the beginning of each period of service. A man's relationship to the rum ration was part of his service record, a fact about him as permanent as his height or the colour of his eyes. The tot glasses themselves had their own rules. Kept separate from the ship's general glassware, they were washed only on the outside, an arrangement that was not accidental but deliberate, designed to prevent the glass from absorbing water in a way that might thin the measure. The logic was precise and entirely serious. Men who worked with rum every day understood its chemistry, even if they would not have used that word. They understood that moisture weakened the spirit, that a poorly stored tot was a lesser tot, and that the material quality of the drink was worth protecting through the small daily rituals that governed its handling. The cooperage workers who maintained the barrels occupying the rum store understood this better than anyone. The barrels that held the spirit were not passive containers. They were living things in the sense that wooden casks interacted with their contents, absorbing and releasing, expanding and contracting with the heat of the tropics and the cold of northern passages. The men who worked the cooperage, who emptied and refilled and inspected and resealed those casks, were embedded in the rum economy as surely as the supply rating with his measuring ladle. They were known informally as groggers, a label that bound the labour of barrel maintenance to the social life of the drink itself. In their work, the rum economy was most clearly visible as a physical system, a set of objects maintained by specific people, producing specific outcomes at a specific hour of the day. What that hour produced went beyond chemistry. Across the decades of long service in the Caribbean and beyond, the rum ration functioned as something the Navy never quite admitted officially, but relied on completely, a mechanism of morale. Men serving months or years away from home, in conditions that combined physical hardship with radical monotony, needed more than sufficient calories and clean water to remain functional crews. They needed something to anticipate, something to mark the day, something that signalled, however briefly, that the institution they served recognised their humanity and not merely their utility. The tot was that signal. It was small, carefully measured and tightly controlled, but it arrived every day, reliably, at a known hour, in a known form according to a ritual everyone shared. The purser's ledger recorded all of it, every tot, every dilution, every temperance exemption, every barrel opened and every measure poured. Reading those ledgers now is like reading a kind of daily biography of the ship, not its battles or its navigational triumphs, but its daily life, the quiet rhythm of an institution that ran on discipline and routine and the precise administration of small comforts. The purser was not a romantic figure. He was an accountant in uniform, responsible for ensuring that what left the rum store matched what appeared in the columns, that the Navy's resources were consumed at exactly the rate the regulations specified and no faster. His short measure was famous. The phrase purser's measure entered the language as a byword for exactitude verging on stinginess. But the exactitude had a purpose. At sea, abundance and shortage were separated by a very thin margin, and the rum store was too important to manage carelessly. What the ledger could not record was the texture of those moments around the rum tub, the way a ship's company settled into itself at the midday ration, the conversations that happened there, the small negotiations and exchanges and acts of generosity that the tot system enabled. A sailor who had saved his ration could offer it to a shipmate who had done him a service. This practice, known as sippers and gulpers, became its own informal economy, a system of obligation and favour running beneath the official one. Sippers was a taste, a gesture. Gulpers was the whole thing, a significant debt to be repaid. The rum ration did not simply move vertically through the ship's hierarchy. It moved horizontally through the ship's human relationships, binding men to each other through small transactions that the purser's ledger was never designed to capture. This was the rum economy at its most elemental, a system precise enough to satisfy an accountant and human enough to sustain a crew. It held together because both halves were real, the measurements and the rituals, the ledger and the rum tub, the hierarchy and the fellowship that the Daily Tot, in its small way, helped hold in place. The barrel on deck was not simply a container, it was a social institution, and it would take another 2 centuries before anyone in authority seriously considered what might replace it. The man who changed what was inside that barrel did not look like a reformer. Admiral Edward Vernon was not the kind of officer who softened things or apologized for his opinions. He was loud, combative, politically inconvenient, and deeply convinced that he was right about almost everything. His men called him Old Grog, after the stiff grogram cloth coat he wore against the Caribbean wind, a heavy, coarse garment that became so associated with him that sailors used the name the way men always name the things that define someone. Not as mockery exactly, but as recognition. Old Grogram shortened eventually to Old Grog. The coat was part of the man, and the man was about to become part of the drink. On the 4th of August 1740, Vernon issued an order to the ships under his command in the West Indies. It was not a suggestion. It was a formal directive, reissued with additional clarification on the 21st of August to make certain no officer could claim he had misunderstood. The order was precise, and its language was not diplomatic. Vernon's preamble described what he called the swinish vice of drunkenness as something that destroys morals, health, and duty aboard His Majesty's ships. The daily spirit ration, that half pint of rum which had become, over the decades since Jamaica was seized from the Spanish, as fixed a feature of naval life as the watch bell or the captain's log, would no longer be served neat. From that point forward, every man's ration would be diluted with water. 4 parts water to 1 part rum. The half pint of spirit mixed into a quart of water, then divided into 2 servings, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. The mathematics were clear and the intention was clearer still. A man who received his rum in 2 watered portions across the span of a working day was a different kind of man, in Vernon's assessment, than one who swallowed an undiluted half pint in a single moment. He was more functional, he was less dangerous. He was, if the calculation held, better at his work and less likely to make catastrophic decisions in the hours that followed the ration. Vernon was not wrong about the problem he was trying to solve. A warship in the Caribbean heat, crewed by men for whom the daily rum ration had become the emotional and social centre of the day, was not an environment that tolerated the kind of impairment that full-strength spirit, taken whole, could produce. The Royal Navy had been grappling with the consequences of undiluted distribution since rum replaced the earlier beer and brandy rations, since Jamaica had made Caribbean spirit so readily available that curbing it required actual administrative force rather than simple scarcity. Accidents happened, duty suffered. Men who should have been at their posts were somewhere else, or were present in body but not in any reliable way in mind. The purser's ledger recorded the ration with precision, but it could not record what the ration cost the ship in terms of the hours that followed distribution. What Vernon's order changed was not the quantity of spirit a man received. It changed the delivery, the speed, the concentration, the way the alcohol moved through the body of someone working in tropical sun. A sailor drinking watered grog twice across the course of a day was being managed carefully by an admiral who understood that the ration was not going away. He had no interest in removing it. He was not a temperance campaigner in any modern sense of the term. He was a naval commander with a practical problem, and dilution was the practical answer. The ceremony around the rum tub, the social ritual that bound a ship's company to itself, those things he left largely intact. What he altered was the pharmacology, the way the spirit moved through the blood of men who had work to do. The drink that resulted took his name, Grog. Not Grogram, not Old Grog in the full form, but the shortened version, which acquired its own life almost immediately. It spread through the fleet as quickly as orders travel between ships, and it settled into the language of the Navy in a way that suggests it filled a gap that had been waiting for a word. Grog was what you drank. Groggy was what you felt when the balance went wrong. The terminology embedded itself so thoroughly that it outlasted Vernon, outlasted the Royal Navy's rum ration entirely, and eventually escaped into civilian life, where it remains, centuries later, as one of those words whose origins have become invisible through familiarity. Most people who use the word groggy to describe the feeling of waking badly or moving slowly through an uncertain morning have no idea they are invoking the memory of a difficult admiral in a heavy coat standing on a deck somewhere in the Caribbean in 1740. Vernon's order allowed, without mandating, certain additions to the basic formula. His letters acknowledged that practical men, what he called good husbandmen of the ration, might add sugar or lime to make the diluted drink more palatable to crews accustomed to taking their spirits straight. This was permission, not instruction. The Admiralty's formal regulations continued to specify only the water dilution, and what happened on any given ship depended on the supply of such additions, the inclinations of the officers overseeing distribution, and the latitude of their particular station. A vessel operating in waters where limes were plentiful might serve something that tasted quite different from the grog distributed aboard a ship 3 months out of any useful port. By the later 18th century and well into the 19th, many crews had developed a regular practice of adding lime juice and a pinch of sugar to their grog, a habit that carried benefits no one fully understood at the time. The vitamin C in citrus was not yet a concept anyone in the Royal Navy had organised into policy, though the practical connection between lime juice and the prevention of scurvy was becoming harder to ignore as the evidence accumulated across decades of long voyages. The addition was welcomed on grounds of taste long before it was understood on grounds of nutrition. What was happening, quietly and without official acknowledgement in most fleet regulations, was that the grog formula was becoming a kind of distributed medicine, its anti-scurvy properties emerging as a side effect of what began as an attempt to make a watered-down drink bearable. But the inconsistency was real and should not be smoothed over. The fleet was not a single entity operating under identical conditions. It was dozens of ships in dozens of places, with different officers, different supply lines, different interpretations of what the regulations permitted. Some crews drank their grog with lime and sugar as a matter of daily routine. Others drank it plain, because the additions were not available or not prioritised. The grog formula that Vernon set in motion in 1740 reshaped naval drinking culture across generations, but it did not produce uniformity. It produced a framework within which an enormous range of actual practice was possible, and that range was never entirely resolved by Admiralty regulation. What the order did do, unambiguously, was alter the rhythm of the day aboard a Royal Navy vessel in a way that proved durable enough to survive for more than 2 centuries. The 2-portion distribution, morning and afternoon, restructured the social ceremony around the rum tub without destroying it. Men still gathered. The ritual still marked the hours. The hierarchy of petty officers and junior ratings still played out around the distribution in the ways it always had. But the character of the gathering changed. The edge came off, and whether that edge had been part of what made the old ration valuable, or part of what made it dangerous, was the kind of question that Vernon, in his grogram coat, had already decided he knew the answer to. The grog he created was not the spirit Penn's men had first loaded in Jamaica. It was something new, something managed, diluted, divided across the hours, and named for a coat. And in that naming, something passed from the Admiral into the language itself, quietly, the way the best institutional changes travel, not announced but absorbed, until no one can quite remember a time before them. The grog in those wooden cups did not begin at sea. It began in the ground, in the cane fields of Barbados, Jamaica, and St. Kitts, where sugar was king, and everything else in the economy existed in relation to it. To understand how rum became the financial backbone of an empire, you have to follow what happened to the parts of the cane that the refiners did not want. Sugar refining produced 2 things. The first was sugar, the product the planters were in the business of selling. The second was molasses, the dark, viscous syrup that could not be fully crystallized out of the cane juice no matter how many times you boiled and purified the batch. For most of the 17th century, molasses was essentially waste. The refineries produced roughly 1 gallon of it for every 2 gallons of refined sugar, and in quantities that large, on islands that small, there was not much you could do with it except let it accumulate, or dump it, or find someone who would take it off your hands. New England took it. By the mid-18th century, the British West Indies were shipping around 1 million gallons of molasses each year north to the American colonies. What arrived in those barrels was not waste by the time it reached the harbour. It was raw material. Massachusetts alone was running 63 distilleries, producing approximately 700,000 gallons of rum annually. Rhode Island ran 30 more, adding another 500,000 gallons. Boston hosted over 25 distilleries within its own city limits. What the Caribbean plantations discarded, New England turned into the most traded commodity on the Atlantic. A barrel of molasses, 252 gallons, yielded somewhere between 45 and 55 gallons of finished rum, depending on the still, the fermentation, and the quality of the raw syrup. The margins were not exceptional per barrel, but the volume was staggering, and the economics worked because of what rum could purchase. Here is where the trade reveals its real architecture. A quart of rum in a 1760 New England ledger sold for 1 shilling and 6pence, a modest price, a working price, a commodity price. It was not sold as a luxury. It was sold the way you sell something designed to move in quantity, to cross oceans in bulk, to serve not as a fine thing but as a medium of exchange. And the exchange it was most suited for was not in New England, or in Britain, or in any European city. It was on the West African coast. Ships loaded with rum barrels sailed east. The records from one documented voyage, a Newport sloop active in 1773 and 1774, show the specific arithmetic with a clarity that is almost unbearable to read. The crew used approximately 225 gallons of rum per enslaved person to negotiate purchases on the Gold Coast. That voyage acquired 60 people. The surviving 51 after the crossing were exchanged in the Caribbean, traded for molasses, which went back to New England, which became rum again. The triangle closed, and then it opened again, and again, in the same pattern, across the same ocean for generations. The financial logic that made this system durable was not accidental. It was constructed, refined, and defended. Rum was cheap enough to produce in massive quantities in New England, which had easy access to molasses. It was valuable enough on the African coast to purchase human beings. Those people, once transported and sold to Caribbean plantation owners, produced more sugar, which produced more molasses, which went north to become more rum. The byproduct funded the labour force that created the byproduct. The waste material financed the system that generated the waste. It was circular in the way that the most efficient exploitation always is, self-reinforcing, self-financing, and extraordinarily difficult to interrupt from inside. And at every point in that circle there was violence, not as an unfortunate side effect, as a structural requirement. The cane fields of Jamaica and Barbados and St. Kitts were worked by enslaved Africans under conditions of enforced brutality. The ships that carried people across the Atlantic did so with a casualty rate that the merchants factored into their projections. The rum that purchased those people on the African coast was itself produced by colonial enterprises, whose labour relationships range from coerced indentured work to outright enslavement. There is no version of this trade that separates the rum from its foundations. The molasses and the rum and the ships and the profits were built on forced labour and sustained by the threat of lethal force at every stage of production. The British imperial state did not stand apart from this. It organised it. After the capture of Jamaica in 1655, the Royal Navy had gained both a Caribbean base and a direct stake in the sugar economy it protected. Naval fleets patrolled the shipping lanes that carried molasses to New England and rum to Africa, and enslaved people back to the islands. They guarded the rum line not out of sentiment, but because the rum line was also the sugar line, and the molasses line, and the slave line, because all of those things were the same line, the same commercial circuit, and because the empire's revenues depended on its uninterrupted operation. A ship's ability to remain at sea was measured in part by its rum stores. The spirit kept without spoiling took less space than the equivalent calories in beer, and sustained crews across crossings that would have been logistically impossible to provision otherwise. The navy that drank rum also protected the trade that produced it. Imperial competition sharpened all of this. France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands were all operating their own variations of the same triangle, and the Caribbean islands that produced molasses were, in the 18th century, among the most intensely contested real estate on Earth. A sugar island was not just an agricultural asset, it was a node in the most profitable commercial network in the Atlantic world. When navies fought in Caribbean waters, they were fighting over the machinery that turned enslaved labour into refined sugar into molasses waste, and molasses waste into the rum that kept the whole circuit funded and moving. The New England colonies understood their position in this structure precisely, and they understood it most clearly when Britain tried to tax their access to it. The Molasses Act of 1733 placed a duty on foreign molasses, meaning molasses from French and Dutch Caribbean colonies that New England distillers had been purchasing because it was cheaper than the British supply could meet. The intent was to protect British West Indian planters. The effect was to make New England rum production either more expensive or more illegal, depending on which distillers chose to pay the duty and which chose to smuggle. Most smuggled. The rum economy was too large, too entrenched, and too profitable to be redirected by a tariff that the colonial merchants had no voice in setting. That resentment accumulated. When the Sugar Act of 1764 revised the molasses duty and added enforcement mechanisms with actual teeth, the anger sharpened into something that fed directly into the larger argument about taxation and representation that was already building across the colonies. The rum barrel was not separate from those arguments. It was one of their central objects. The distilleries of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the molasses ships in Boston Harbor, the merchants whose balance sheets ran through the triangular trade, all of them had a stake in who controlled the terms of that commerce, and none of them were inclined to accept that the decision belonged solely to a parliament they had no part in electing. The rum that came out of New England's distilleries, then, was not simply a beverage. It was a commodity that had passed through the cane fields of the Caribbean, through the accounting books of slavers on the African coast, through the Atlantic crossing of enslaved people, and back again, and it arrived in the glass of anyone who drank it carrying all of that history inside it, invisible, dissolved, indistinguishable from the sweetness of the molasses that had started the whole circuit turning. To understand that circuit at its source, you have to step off the ship and walk into the field. A Caribbean sugar plantation in the mid-18th century was not a farm in any sense that the word usually implies. It was a factory that happened to grow its raw material in the ground. On a typical Jamaican estate of around 500 acres, every element of the operation, the fields, the mill, the boiling house, the still, was arranged not for pastoral convenience but for industrial throughput. The planting, cutting, processing, and distillation ran as a continuous chain, and the chain never really stopped. Not in harvest season, not at night, not when people were exhausted beyond the point where exhaustion has a useful meaning. The cane itself took roughly 14 months to mature. When it was ready, it had to be cut immediately. Cane begins to lose its sugar content within hours of being cut, so the harvest was not something you could pace. You cut, and you hauled, and you fed the mill, and the mill ran, and the boiling house ran, and the cooling house ran, and the still ran, all at once, all together, with no slack in the schedule and no tolerance for delay. An estate running 300 pots of sugar per week, a pace that the planter William Belgrove recorded as achievable on a well-run Jamaican property in 1755, needed its entire workforce operating across shifts that stretched to 18 hours, and during the most intense cutting periods, workers sometimes went 48 hours without sleep. The workforce that made this possible was enslaved. A 500-acre estate required approximately 300 enslaved people to function. They were valued in the plantation ledgers. Belgrove calculated this figure at around £12,000 sterling, as capital assets, listed alongside the copper-boiling vessels and the millstones and the distillation equipment. They appeared in the accounting the same way a steam engine would later appear, as infrastructure, as fixed investment, as a cost to be recovered through the output they generated. The work itself was specific in its brutality. Cane cutting was done by hand with machetes through stalks that grew taller than a person and were edged with leaves sharp enough to cut skin on contact. The ground between the rows was uneven, the heat was constant, and the pace was enforced. Cuts were routine. Infections followed the cuts, because the fields were not clean places, and there was no real provision for treating wounds. The mortality figures that historians have drawn from plantation records are stark. Roughly a third of newly arrived enslaved Africans died within their first 3 years on the islands. Their bodies not yet adapted to the disease environment and already subjected to labour conditions that offered almost no recovery time. Once the cane was cut, it was hauled to the mill. Before 1768, milling was done by animal or wind power, heavy rollers that crushed the stalks and pressed out the juice. In that year, a Jamaican plantation installed the first steam-powered mill in the Caribbean, a technological step that increased throughput and pushed the industrial logic of sugar production one stage further. But whether the power came from a mule or a Watt engine, the basic process was the same. The crushed juice ran into channels and flowed to the boiling house. The boiling house was where sugar became itself. Large copper vessels, the coppers as they were called, were arranged in sequence, each one smaller and hotter than the last. The juice was boiled down progressively, losing water and concentrating sugars until it reached the consistency of a heavy syrup. Then it was poured into clay molds or wooden forms to crystallize. What drained away during crystallization was molasses. Dark, thick, sweet, in a way that refined sugar is not, carrying everything that the crystallization process had pushed out. Unfermentable sugars, mineral compounds, the residues of a plant that had been grown in volcanic Caribbean soil and cut at the peak of its sugar content. This molasses drained into collection cisterns, and then something happened to it that planters in the early 17th century had not planned for and did not fully control. It fermented on its own. Water in the cisterns, wild yeast in the humid air, the residue of previous batches coating the interior of the vessels, all of these contributed to a spontaneous fermentation that early Caribbean settlers noticed produced something intoxicating. What began as observed accident became managed process. By the mid-17th century, plantation operators were deliberately combining molasses with water, and the skimmings from the boiling coppers, a foamy, yeast-rich liquid called dunder, and allowing the mixture to ferment in large wooden vats for days, sometimes weeks. The resulting wash smelled of overripe fruit and alcohol and something darker underneath, something burned and mineral and complex, a smell that was specific to this material, this climate, this particular chemistry. That wash went into the still. The early plantation stills were crude by later standards, copper pot stills heated by wood fires, producing a raw spirit that came out harsh and hot, and full of the kind of heavy compounds that smooth out only with time and dilution. The first distillation produced what was called low wine, a relatively weak spirit. A second passed through the still increased the alcohol content and reduced the worst of the rough edges. What came out was rum, not yet aged, not yet blended, not yet the carefully controlled product that would eventually reach naval stores and tavern shelves, but recognizably rum, sharp, sweet, powerful, and cheap to produce on a site that was already generating the raw material as a byproduct of the process it existed to perform. The plantation accounting captured this double logic precisely. Belgrove's calculations show an estate generating approximately 40,000 gallons of rum annually, roughly 1,800 gallons per week, alongside its sugar output. The annual expenses of running such an estate ran to around £3,000. The total valuation of the estate, including the land, the enslaved workforce, the buildings and the equipment, was calculated at over £31,000. The rum output alone contributed what Belgrove described as a reasonable clear profit, a phrase that in 18th century accounting meant exactly what it sounds like: reliable margin, year over year, predictable enough to plan around. Sugar was still the primary product. The planter's identity, his credit, his relationships with London merchants, his standing in the colonial hierarchy, all of these rested on sugar. But rum was not incidental. Rum was what made the margins work. Every batch of molasses that left the plantation as rum rather than being discarded as waste was a conversion of a cost into a revenue. The boiling house produced molasses as an unavoidable consequence of refining sugar, and the still converted that consequence into profit. The two products reinforced each other in the ledger the way the two sides of any efficient industrial process reinforce each other. The waste of one stage becomes the feedstock of the next, and the overall system becomes more productive than either element alone. This is what made the plantation something genuinely new in the history of production. It was not a farm that also ran a distillery. It was an integrated industrial system that used a single raw material, sugarcane, to produce two exportable commodities, each of which found its own market and generated its own revenue stream. The field supplied the mill supplied the boiling house supplied the still supplied the Atlantic trade, and all of it was powered by 300 people whose labour was not compensated, whose lives were not their own, and whose survival was not the primary variable in the planter's calculations. The steam engine that arrived in a Jamaican mill in 1768 was not the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in sugar. The plantation had been an industrial complex for over a century before that engine was installed. The engine only made the existing logic faster, louder, and capable of running without even the limitation of a wind. What flowed out of the still then was not just rum. It was the concentrated output of an entire system. The cane and the copper, the molasses and the fire, the labour and the accounting, the Caribbean soil and the Atlantic trade wind. All of it reduced and distilled into a dark liquid that smelled of burned sugar and tasted of the island that made it. That dark liquid, once it left the still, needed somewhere to go. The plantation had produced it. The Atlantic trade would move it. But between the still house and the distant customer stood something that every merchant in the 18th century understood to be the decisive force in any commercial equation: the government. By the 1730s, rum and its raw material, molasses, had become the connective tissue of a vast economic network stretching from the Caribbean sugar islands to the distilleries of New England and onward to the fur traders, tavern keepers, and naval provisioners who consumed the finished product. New England, in particular, had built something close to an entire regional industry around the conversion of Caribbean molasses into saleable rum. Distilleries in Boston, Newport, and Providence were buying molasses from whatever Caribbean source offered it cheapest, running it through their stills, and shipping the output north, south, and across the Atlantic. The logic was clean, and the margins were reliable, so long as the molasses kept arriving and arriving affordably. London, watching the system from a considerable distance, saw a problem that the colonists themselves did not recognise as a problem at all. The difficulty, from the British metropolitan perspective, was that much of the molasses flowing into New England was coming not from British Caribbean colonies, but from French and Dutch ones. The islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe produced molasses in large quantities, and they sold it cheaply, because France and its merchants had their own surplus to move. For New England distillers, cheaper was simply better. They had no particular loyalty to the British West Indian planter. They had loyalty to their own balance sheets. For the British West Indian planter, this was an outrage. He had invested heavily in land, labour, and equipment within the imperial system. He paid his taxes, observed the trade regulations, and expected in return that the empire would guarantee him a market. The sight of New England ships loading French molasses at cut-rate prices while his own warehouses sat partly full was not an abstract grievance. It cost him money directly. The planters had powerful friends in Parliament, and in 1733 those friends delivered. The Molasses Act imposed a duty of 6 pence per gallon on molasses imported from non-British colonies. The intent was straightforward: make French and Dutch molasses expensive enough that New England buyers would turn instead to British Caribbean suppliers, redirecting the flow of trade back through the channels the empire preferred. In principle, it was a tidy piece of imperial architecture, a price signal that should have aligned colonial purchasing decisions with metropolitan interests. In practice, it changed almost nothing. The duty was large enough to matter economically, but was enforced through a customs apparatus that was understaffed, underfunded, and, in many ports, openly susceptible to the kind of persuasion that arrived in the form of a discreet payment and an unasked question. Colonial merchants had been navigating the practical realities of Atlantic trade for generations. They understood the geography of every inlet and creek along the New England coast. They maintained relationships with captains who knew how to time a landing for the early morning hours when customs officers tended to be elsewhere. They operated in communities where the distillery owner was also the town selectman, where the merchant who ran the wharf was also the man who appointed the harbour master, where the formal machinery of imperial regulation sat inside a social world that had its own deeply informal methods of getting things done. Smuggling, in this context, was not the work of desperate criminals operating at the margins. It was organised, efficient, and conducted with something close to professional calm. Merchants coordinated with foreign Caribbean producers to arrange reliable supply. Fast, shallow-draft vessels, the same kind of vessel that worked so well for privateers, made clandestine landings at secondary harbours away from the main customs posts. When direct contact with customs officials was unavoidable, the practical solution was almost always financial. The bribe was not a moral failure in the eyes of those who paid it. It was a cost of doing business, like freight charges or barrel staves, something you factored into your accounting and moved on from. The result was that the Molasses Act collected almost nothing and altered almost no behaviour. An estimated 1 million gallons of molasses continued flowing annually into the colonies from non-British sources. Domestic rum output not only held steady but grew. The imperial machinery had issued a declaration, and the Atlantic trade had shrugged and continued. London tried again in 1764. The Sugar Act of that year reduced the duty dramatically, from 6p to 1 per gallon, but what it gained in apparent reasonableness it more than compensated for in enforcement. The new act required importers to post bonds, gave customs officers expanded powers, established vice-admiralty courts to try smuggling cases without juries, and introduced a general framework of commercial oversight that was considerably harder to simply pay your way around. It was, in the eyes of its architects, a more sophisticated instrument, lower rates, stricter mechanisms, real teeth. What it actually was, in the experience of the colonists who encountered it, was something considerably more aggravating than the old unenforced law it replaced. A 6p duty that no one actually collected was, economically speaking, no duty at all. A 1p duty that customs officers were now empowered and incentivized to actually collect was something real. A persistent friction applied to every barrel of molasses that moved through a legitimate port. The bond requirements added cost and bureaucratic complication to the routine of commerce. The vice-admiralty courts, which operated without juries, removed the possibility of sympathetic local judgment in cases of alleged smuggling, replacing it with crown-appointed judges who had every reason to find in favour of a system that paid them through the fines and forfeitures they imposed. Colonial merchants who had spent decades treating the Molasses Act as a theoretical inconvenience now found themselves dealing with an actual one, and their response was not compliance, it was fury. The arguments they made were not merely about rum, though rum and molasses were the immediate occasion for the dispute. They were about the deeper principle of how colonial trade had always functioned, as a practical system built on long-established custom and mutual economic interest, and what it meant when Parliament decided to revise those terms unilaterally, without colonial representation in the discussion, and without evident concern for the disruption the changes caused. New England merchants argued that the rum industry was not a luxury. It was the engine that made their participation in the Atlantic economy possible at all. The molasses they imported paid for the rum they exported, which paid for the British manufactured goods their communities required. Disrupt that chain with enforceable duties, and you did not merely inconvenience a distiller, you threatened the commercial viability of an entire region. Historians have noted the Sugar Act's significance as an explicit irritant on the path toward broader colonial unrest. It preceded the Stamp Act by a year and helped establish the pattern of complaint that would become familiar through the following decade. Metropolitan authority reaching into colonial commercial life in ways that felt both economically harmful and constitutionally irregular. Rum was not the whole story of the American Revolution. Nothing as complicated as that event has a single cause. But the barrel of molasses sitting on a Newport wharf, subject to a duty that the man who owned it considered unjust, and the customs officer assigned to collect it, now actually tried to, was part of the texture of daily grievance that accumulated through the 1760s into something no Act of Parliament could resolve. The smuggling networks that had developed to move Caribbean molasses around the Molasses Act did not disappear after 1764. If anything, they grew more sophisticated. The merchants who had learned to coordinate clandestine supply chains across the Atlantic, to manage fast vessels, cultivate contacts in foreign ports, accumulate capital outside the formal channels of imperial commerce, were developing organizational and financial capacities that would prove useful for purposes well beyond the movement of rum. The same networks that kept New England distilleries supplied with French molasses were also moving tea, cloth, and other contraband, and the men who ran them were accumulating not just goods but experience, confidence, and a practiced sense of how to operate effectively in defiance of an authority they had ceased to respect. What had started as a business decision, buy cheap molasses wherever you can find it, had, through the actions of a parliament that finally decided to enforce what it had long left dormant, become something with a different flavour altogether. The merchants building those smuggling networks were not the first men in the Caribbean to discover that the boundary between sanctioned commerce and outright lawlessness was a line you could move depending on who held the pen. A century earlier, on a low sandy spit at the southeastern tip of Jamaica, a town had grown up around exactly that principle. Port Royal in its prime was one of the most densely inhabited places in the entire English-speaking world, and virtually everything about it was excessive. The heat, the noise, the money changing hands in its counting houses and its taverns, and the violence that settled arguments when counting houses and taverns failed. After England seized Jamaica from Spain in 1655, Port Royal became the administrative and commercial heart of the new colony almost by accident. The harbour was deep, the anchorage was sheltered, and the location put any ship operating out of it within reasonable striking distance of the Spanish Main. Those were, in the 1650s and 1660s, the relevant considerations. By the mid-1660s, the town housed somewhere around 1,500 English and French privateers at any given moment, along with the merchants, tavern keepers, prostitutes, money-lenders, and clergy who served them. The money those privateers brought back from their raids, in gold, silver, trade goods, and slaves, was generating prize hauls that dwarfed the value of Jamaica's sugar exports. The island's survival as an English colony in its early decades had less to do with plantation agriculture than with the systematic plunder of Spanish shipping and coastal towns conducted from its harbours. Port Royal was, in the bluntest possible terms, a pirate economy that had been issued government paperwork. The paperwork mattered, and it did not, depending entirely on who was reading it and in whose interest. A privateer, in the legal architecture of the 17th century, was a private captain who had been issued a letter of marque by a sovereign government, authorising him to attack and seize the ships and property of designated enemies. The letter transformed what would otherwise be piracy, robbery at sea without state sanction, into something resembling licensed warfare. The privateer kept a portion of what he took. His backers and sponsors kept their portions. The government that issued the letter acquired the military and strategic benefits of his operations without having to pay for a standing fleet to achieve them. It was a remarkably efficient arrangement, provided everyone involved understood which side of the line they were standing on. The difficulty was that the line had a tendency to drift. Henry Morgan understood this dynamic better than almost anyone alive in the Caribbean in the 1660s, and he built a career on his ability to stay just close enough to the legal margin to remain employable. Born in Wales sometime around 1635, he arrived in the Caribbean as a young man and worked his way through the privateering world with a combination of genuine tactical intelligence, physical courage, and an exceptionally clear sense of how institutional relationships functioned. When Governor Thomas Modiford issued Morgan a letter of marque in 1667, authorising him to attack Spanish vessels and coastal settlements, he was formalising what had already become the organising logic of the entire colony. What Morgan did with that authorisation was large in scale even by Port Royal's uninhibited standards. The 1668 expedition to Puerto del Príncipe and Portobello brought together somewhere between 500 and 1,000 men across 10 to 12 ships. Portobello was a fortified city, the main transit point for Peruvian silver moving towards Spain, and its capture was not a raid so much as a military operation. Morgan took it. The loot from the 1668 and 1669 operations, Portobello, followed by a punishing assault on the Spanish cities around the Lake of Maracaibo, has been estimated at somewhere between £70,000 and £100,000 sterling, with Morgan retaining roughly 5% and Modiford drawing a 10% commission. The remainder was distributed among the crews according to a system of shares that had its own elaborate internal hierarchy. What everyone involved understood was that this sum was more than 7 times the annual value of Jamaica's sugar exports. The plantation economy was a long-term project. Morgan was delivering results now. Through all of this, rum was present in the way it was present throughout the English Caribbean world of that era, as daily ration, as trade currency, as the liquid medium in which agreements were sealed and grievances were aired. The taverns of Port Royal ran on it. Crews departing on expeditions brought it. The rough accounting that governed the distribution of prize money was conducted in rooms where cups were constantly being refilled. Rum was not incidental to the privateer economy. It was woven through every transaction the economy generated, from the moment a ship cleared the harbour to the moment its crew spent the last of their shares on their return. Morgan's most audacious operation came in 1671, when he assembled a fleet that sources variously estimate at 36 to 38 ships, carrying approximately 2,000 men, and crossed the Isthmus of Panama to attack the Pacific coast city of Panama City itself. The overland march through tropical jungle was a feat of logistics and endurance that contemporary observers found almost incomprehensible. Panama City was sacked. A ransom of 100,000 pesos was extracted. Then Morgan burned much of the city. a detail that would later become legally inconvenient, because by the time the raid took place, England and Spain had signed the Treaty of Madrid of 1670, which was supposed to have ended exactly this kind of hostility. Morgan's letter of marque predated the treaty, but his actions after it came conspicuously close to violating its spirit, and Spain's protest were loud enough that both Morgan and Modiford were recalled to London to answer for what had happened. Here the distinction between privateer and pirate became both most important and most slippery. Morgan had operated under authorization. The authorization had come from a legitimate colonial governor acting within his understood powers, but the treaty changed the political context around actions that the letter of marque had technically permitted, and the Spanish Crown's insistence that Morgan's land raids constituted piracy, regardless of any English paperwork, was not an entirely unreasonable position. The English government in London faced the awkward task of publicly disciplining Morgan, while privately acknowledging that his campaigns had done exactly what they were designed to do: harass Spain, fill colonial coffers, and establish English dominance over a region that England had not yet won through formal military means. Morgan was arrested, transported to London, and then, in a denouement that tells you everything about how the 17th century actually worked, was knighted by Charles II, appointed Deputy Governor of Jamaica, and sent back to the island he had plundered on behalf of, now as its senior official. The line between sanctioned violence and piracy was not, in the end, a moral boundary. It was a political one. When Morgan's raids served English interests, he was a privateer. When they threatened to embarrass English diplomacy, he was briefly a problem. When the political weather shifted again, he was Sir Henry Morgan, and the taverns of Port Royal received him accordingly. What his career illustrated, at scale and in vivid detail, was the opportunity structure that the early Caribbean colonial world had created, a space where the normal restraints of metropolitan law were thin, where violence and commerce blurred into each other, where fortunes could be made by men with the nerve to operate in the ambiguous zone between the King's Commission and the hangman's rope. The rum flowing through Port Royal's taverns was a product of the same system, the same plantation labour, the same Atlantic commerce, the same calculated willingness to extract value by whatever means the moment permitted. Within 2 decades of Morgan's death in 1688, Port Royal itself would be gone, swallowed by an earthquake and tsunami in 1692 that dropped 2/3 of the town into the harbour. Survivors described it as divine judgment on a city that had earned one. What they left behind beneath the water was an archaeological record of exactly how that world had lived, and in the taverns and counting houses and privateer ships that had orbited it, the outlines of a maritime culture that rum had helped to build and that the sea had, in the end, reclaimed. Port Royal went into the harbour in 1692, but the stories it generated refused to follow. They spread instead, through sailors' memoirs, tavern tellings, pamphlets printed in London and Boston, and eventually into the kind of literary mythology that hardens around a historical moment until it becomes almost impossible to see what was actually there beneath the embellishment. The image of the rum-drinking pirate, cup raised in a torchlit tavern, prize cargo stacked on the docks outside, became one of the most durable figures in Western romantic imagination. Like most durable images, it was built on a real foundation, and then decorated until the decoration became the thing people remembered. The foundation was genuine enough. Rum fit the seafaring outlaw life for reasons that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with practicality. It was portable. It concentrated well. A relatively small cask could carry the alcoholic equivalent of a much larger volume of wine or beer. It did not spoil the way fermented grain beverages did in tropical heat. When a pirate crew took a prize cargo in Caribbean waters, the likelihood that the hold contained casks of cane spirit was high, because rum moved constantly through the Atlantic trade networks of the 17th and 18th centuries, from Caribbean distilleries to North American colonies, from colonial warehouses to ships provisioning for long voyages, from ship to ship in the form of barter and exchange. A captured half hogshead of rum was not just a luxury, it was a liquid asset that could be drunk on the spot to celebrate the capture, used to pay informants and officials in ports where coin was awkward, or sold the moment the crew reached a friendly harbour. Prize rum was currency that happened to also be intoxicating. The taverns of places like Port Royal ran on the same logic. Contemporary accounts describe ordinary drinking houses in the city serving rum punch for 3 pence a half pint, often mixed 3 parts water to 1 part spirit. a dilution that stretched the supply and made the economics work for the proprietor, while still delivering enough proof to satisfy a crew that had been at sea for weeks. The clientele was not exclusively piratical. Sailors, merchants, dock workers, and the whole commercial apparatus of the colonial port mixed in those rooms. But the privateer economy that Port Royal had been built around meant that the men with the most money to spend were frequently the men who had just come back from a raid, and the cultural atmosphere they created, loud, violent, liquid with rum and the anticipation of the next venture, was the atmosphere that later storytellers would reach for when they wanted to evoke the Caribbean golden age of piracy. What the storytellers exaggerated was the constancy. Contemporary accounts, when they are specific enough to be trusted, describe something closer to cycles: binge drinking after a successful haul, followed by extended periods of relative sobriety, when the economics of the voyage required discipline, and the rum had simply run out. The image of perpetual swilling was a later romantic projection onto what was in practice a more complicated relationship between a working crew and its provisions. Rum was central to pirate life. It was not the entirety of it. The stories, however, had their own momentum, and some of them attached themselves to figures and events that were real enough to lend them credibility. Among the most persistent is the legend known as Nelson's Blood. The story holds that after Admiral Horatio Nelson was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, his body was placed in a cask of spirits, most versions specify rum or brandy, to preserve it for the voyage back to England. So far this part is documented. The preservation of bodies in alcohol for long sea passages was an established practice. What the legend adds is the detail that corrupts the story into something far darker, that sailors aboard the ship, unable to resist, drilled holes into the cask and drank the fluid, drinking, in the legend's framing, the Admiral's blood along with the spirit that had mingled with it. The story is told with particular relish in certain naval museums, and it has attached itself to Nelson so thoroughly that the phrase Nelson's Blood became a common naval slang term for rum itself. But no contemporary naval log, no ship's record, no first-hand account from the voyage confirms that the drinking actually happened. The Royal Museum's Greenwich, which holds Nelson's legacy with considerable care, treats the tale as what it almost certainly is, a piece of folklore that condensed a genuinely strange and melancholy fact, the great admiral in a barrel, preserved like a specimen, into a myth about the intimacy between sailors and their rum, between death at sea and the spirit that made the sea bearable. The horror and the dark comedy of it are precisely why it survived. It did not need to be true to carry meaning. The Mary Celeste offers a different species of rum legend, and this one begins with documented fact. In November 1872, the American brigantine was found adrift in the Atlantic, seaworthy but completely abandoned. Her cargo was intact, 1,701 wooden barrels of commercial alcohol, later identified as denatured industrial spirits rather than drinking rum, though the distinction was lost almost immediately in subsequent retellings. The crew was gone. No sign of violence was found. The lingering vapour from the barrels had apparently spooked the boarding party from the vessel that discovered her, and that detail, a ghost ship reeking of spirits, her crew vanished without explanation, was everything a storyteller needed to transform a maritime mystery into a legend of cursed rum barrels, supernatural retribution, and the sea collecting its debts. The actual most likely explanation involves a combination of a faulty alcohol gauge, the captain's reasonable fear of an explosion risk, and a tragic miscalculation about what to do next. The legend of the cursed cargo is considerably better theatre. What both stories share, and what connects them to the broader mythology of rum and the sea, is the way they condensed real historical forces into emotionally legible narratives. The rum trade was, as this story has traced, inseparable from imperial violence, plantation slavery, the casual brutality of naval life, and the enormous mortality of the Atlantic crossing. A barrel of rum sitting in a ship's hold in 1805 or 1872 carried the accumulated weight of all of that. The cane fields, the enslaved people who cut them, the triangular trade that moved molasses into New England distilleries, and rum back across the Atlantic, the sailors who drank their rations and fought their wars. The legends that formed around rum barrels and pirate cups were not merely entertainment. They were a way of processing something enormous and disturbing through the manageable grammar of a good story. The romantic image of the pirate with his cup was built from real material. The tavern culture of Port Royal, the prize cargoes taken at sea, the portable logic of a spirit that travelled well and concentrated value in a small space. But it was burnished into legend by the same impulse that turned Nelson's preserved body into a communion story and the Mary Celeste's alcohol cargo into a ghost ship narrative. The need to make the scale of what the rum trade represented fit inside a human throat to reduce an empire's worth of sugar, slavery and sea violence to something a person could hold in their hand and drink. The stories survived because they were useful that way, and the rum that inspired them moved on, finding its next chapter not in pirate taverns or ghost ships, but in the formal, meticulous, entirely official world of the Admiralty blend. The Admiralty was not, by temperament, a romantic institution. It kept ledgers, it filed contracts, it specified strengths and quantities and delivery schedules with the same methodical attention it brought to the calibration of cannon and the provisioning of salt beef. So when the rum ration passed from the ad hoc world of pirate taverns and prize cargoes into the formal machinery of naval administration, something interesting happened. The spirit that had accumulated all those legends and myths became, in the hands of the victualling officers, a bureaucratic object. And bureaucratic objects, as it turns out, have their own kind of fascinating complexity. For the first century and a half of the naval rum ration, what a sailor received in his daily issue depended heavily on where his ship happened to be and what the nearest colonial port had available. Jamaica, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, the source varied, and so did the product. Different islands produced spirits with noticeably different characters. The heavy, ester-rich pot-still rums of Jamaica tasted nothing like the lighter, column-distilled output that would eventually come to define Trinidadian production, and neither of those resembled the big, dark, molasses-forward spirits being made along the Demerara River in what was then British Guiana. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Navy issued whatever it could procure, and consistency was simply not a priority that anyone was organised enough to enforce. That changed in the early 19th century. The Admiralty, responding to the practical demands of managing a global fleet from a centralised administration, shifted its approach to rum procurement in a significant way. Rather than accepting whatever colonial spirit happened to arrive, it began commissioning a custom-blended rum. The idea was straightforward in principle, and complicated in execution. Collect spirits from across the empire, blend them together in large vats at the victualling yards, allow the mixture to mellow and stabilise, and then issue a uniform product that would taste, or at least approximate tasting, the same whether a sailor was stationed in Portsmouth or the Pacific. Consistency was the goal. The ration had to be reliable enough to administer as a fixed quantity, and that meant the thing being rationed had to remain more or less constant from batch to batch. The Empire was a vast pantry to draw from, and the Admiralty's procurement reached into it accordingly. Demerara became the backbone of the blend. The rum produced along the Demerara River had particular qualities that suited the Navy's purposes. It was robust, aged well in tropical conditions before being shipped to England, and had the kind of weight and flavour profile that held its character when blended with lighter spirits. Trinidad contributed significantly across the 20th century, providing a somewhat cleaner counterpoint to the heavy Demerara base. Jamaican rum, with its distinctive aromatic intensity, appeared in the blend only in exceptional circumstances. The wartime shortages of 1944 brought Jamaican markers into the procurement contracts when the usual sources could not meet demand, and the purchase ledgers from that period named specific estates and distilleries with the straightforward practicality of a supply officer managing a problem. By 1866, the Admiralty had fixed the issuing strength of naval rum at 54.5% alcohol by volume. Spirit caramel was added to standardise colour and contribute to the flavour stability that the blend needed to survive storage in the victualling yards, and then the further indignities of shipboard conditions. These were not casual decisions. They reflected decades of experience with how rum behaved in casks, how it changed during long voyages, and what a sailor would actually taste when he drew his daily tot from the ship's rum tub. The broker who handled procurement on behalf of the Admiralty was the firm ED&F man, and their contracts survive in fragments, tantalising, specific, and ultimately incomplete. The 1944 contracts, for instance, name particular Demerara Marquez, Port Mouron, Versailles, estates whose names meant something to people who knew the geography of British Guiana's plantation belt and the particular character of the spirits each distillery produced. These records tell us something genuine and specific about what went into the blend during that particular wartime period. But they are snapshots, not a continuous record. The Admiralty's purchase ledgers exist only in fragments, and what those fragments show is that the blend shifted over time as supply conditions, colonial politics, and the availability of specific spirits all changed. This is where the historical picture becomes genuinely murky, and it is worth dwelling on that murkiness rather than smoothing it over. No single definitive Navy rum recipe existed. Historians who have gone looking for one in the archives have come back with partial answers and conflicting figures. Some accounts describe a blend that ran roughly 70% Demerara to 30% Trinidad in the mid-20th century. Others note additional Caribbean or even East Indian contributions at various points. The sources differ on the precise percentages, and the fragmentary nature of the surviving records means that the full annual blend ratios for most years remain unknown. What we have is a broad pattern, Demerara dominant, Trinidad contributing, Jamaica exceptional, rather than a precise formula. Anyone who claims otherwise is doing some creative rounding. What we can say with confidence is that the Daily Tot connected a sailor on a Royal Navy vessel to a chain of production that stretched across the British imperial world. When a rating on a destroyer in the North Atlantic drew his issue of Admiralty rum in 1942, the spirit in his cup had travelled from cane fields along the Demerara River, through distilleries that had been operating since the 18th century, across the Atlantic to English victualling yards, where it had been blended and vatted and aged into something uniform enough to administer at scale, and then back out to sea. It carried, in a very literal sense, the geography of empire. The places that produced it, Demerara, Trinidad, occasionally Jamaica, were not interchangeable. They were specific locations with specific histories, specific soils, specific distilling traditions, and specific relationships to the plantation economy that had made them legible to the Admiralty in the first place. The ration was both of those things simultaneously, a bureaucratic system and a cultural inheritance. As a system, it was managed by brokers, specified in contracts, issued at fixed strengths, recorded in ships' logs, and subject to the same auditing processes that governed any other naval provision. As an inheritance, it carried everything that had come before, the early colonial improvisation, the naval traditions that had formed around Vernon's Grog, the long 18th-century life of the tot as a daily ritual that structured time aboard ship and provided a fixed point of social identity for the men who received it. Sailors who served through the 20th century's great naval conflicts received their rum with the awareness, at least partly, that men had been receiving that same daily tot for over 2 centuries before them. The ration was a thread connecting them to something very old. The blend that the Admiralty had assembled so carefully from Demerara and Trinidad and occasionally from the wartime resources of Jamaica was not, in the end, a fixed thing. It was a moving target, a practical answer to the logistical challenge of supplying a global fleet with a consistent product from a colonial world that was itself always changing. That the exact percentages remain uncertain, that the recipe was never standardized in a way that a single document could definitively capture, is perhaps appropriate. The Admiralty rum was an imperial product, and empire was never as tidy as its administrators wished. What it produced was real enough, a daily ritual, a flavour that several generations of sailors knew with the intimacy of a thing experienced every day of their working lives, and a tradition that was now, in the mid-20th century, approaching its end. The thread that had connected sailors across 2.5 centuries to the geography of empire, to the cane fields and distilleries and victualling yards of the Atlantic world, was about to be cut. It would be cut not by an enemy broadside, not by some catastrophic failure of supply, but by a parliamentary debate that lasted exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. The arguments that reached the House of Commons in the opening weeks of 1970 were practical ones, framed in the language of modern military necessity. When MP James Wellbeloved brought the matter to the floor on the 28th of January, the case against the rum ration had already been assembled with the kind of institutional clarity that the Admiralty reserved for decisions it had already quietly made. The written answer from the Admiralty Board, delivered the previous December, put it plainly. The daily rum issue was no longer compatible with the high standards of efficiency required when a sailor's task involved complex, delicate machinery and systems whose proper functioning could mean the difference between life and death. That sentence was worth reading carefully. It was not saying that sailors had become drunkards, or that the tot had caused disasters, or that the tradition had failed in any visible, demonstrable way. It was saying something more subtle and, in its own way, more final. It was saying that the world had changed around the ration, The navy that Edward Vernon had commanded was one of ropes, canvas, capstans and guns that a man loaded by hand in the dark. The navy of 1970 was one of sonar arrays, nuclear submarines, and weapons systems whose tolerances were measured in fractions of a second. The Tot had survived the age of iron warships and 2 world wars. It had not survived the transistor. The parliamentary debate closed at 22:29 that January evening. The decision was made. The date was set. On the 31st of July 1970, the Royal Navy would pour its last official tot. What happened between that parliamentary vote and that July morning tells you something about the distance between institutional logic and human feeling. The Admiralty had done its accounting as institutions do. It offered £2.7 million to establish a sailors' fund, welfare facilities, recreational provisions, the practical consolations of a modern employer. Senior ratings would be permitted limited duty-free spirit purchases. Junior ratings, in a substitution that sailors greeted with the enthusiasm it deserved, could buy up to 3 cans of beer per day. The ledger had been balanced, the exchange had been made, the sailors responded with a ceremony. Across ships and shore establishments around the world, the 31st of July arrived with the weight of something that everyone understood to be irrevocable. The traditional pipe sounded at 6 bells of the forenoon watch, 11 in the morning by the clock on the wall, but aboard a Royal Navy vessel always measured in the older rhythm of the watch system. Up Spirits was called, as it had been called every day for longer than anyone serving could remember, for longer than their fathers or grandfathers had been alive. The rum tubs were brought out, the tots were poured, and then sailors put on black armbands. At HMS Collingwood, the Royal Naval Electrical College, someone had organised a mock funeral. There was a shrouded coffin, there were drummers, a piper played. The coffin moved through the establishment with the solemnity that the institution generally reserved for the actual dead, and that deliberate borrowing of the language of grief was not accidental or theatrical. It was precise. Something was being buried. Not a barrel of rum exactly, but what a barrel of rum had meant across 250 years of naval life. On ships at sea, sailors buried their final tots differently. Some poured them over the side, returning the spirit to the water in the way that old maritime cultures had always made offerings to the sea. Some drank theirs in silence, some drank in company. The gestures varied, but the shared understanding of what the moment represented held across all of them. This was the last point of contact with something that reached back through the whole history of the sailing navy, through the ironclads and the wooden walls, back through Vernon's grog to the first cane spirit issued on a Caribbean station in the middle of the 17th century. What the black armbands and the mock funerals and the buried tots were expressing was something the Admiralty had not quite accounted for in its £2.7 million welfare fund. The rum ration was not simply a daily drink. It had been a structuring principle of naval time, a daily ritual that divided the forenoon watch and gave sailors a fixed social moment that belonged to them rather than to the institution. The call to up spirits had for generations been one of the most welcome sounds a man could hear aboard ship, not because the tot itself was large, or because the alcohol was the point, but because the moment it created was. Men drew their tot together. Senior ratings received a half gill. Junior ratings, who were tea men, teetotalers, received 3p in lieu. Even the refusal of the ration had a name, a category, a place in the ship's accounting. The tot was so embedded in naval culture that it had generated its own vocabulary, its own customs, its own elaborate social code around who could sippers and who could gulpers from a generous messmate's measure. All of that ended at 6 bells on the 31st of July 1970. What Black Tot Day revealed, in its strange mixture of institutional decree and spontaneous mourning, was how much of a naval identity had been organised around the inheritance from the sailing era. The Navy had modernised its ships, its weapons, its training, its communications. It had kept the rum, and in keeping the rum it had kept a direct daily physical connection to the world that had existed before steam, before steel, before electronics, the world of Jamaican cane fields and Demerara distilleries and victualling yards where brokers assembled blends from the furthest edges of empire. The tot was the last living artifact of that world inside a working naval institution. When it went, something more abstract went with it. The idea that a modern service could carry within itself, unreformed and unapologized for, the material culture of the age of sail. Other traditions survived. The Royal Navy retained its ceremonies, its ranks, its languages, its history written into every ship's name. But those were commemorative. The rum ration had been operational. It had happened every day. It had been drunk, not displayed. The ceremony of Black Tot Day was in this sense entirely appropriate. Sailors understood that they were not simply losing a perk or surrendering a comfort. They were marking the moment when the last practical thread connecting them to Vernon's fleet, to Penn's Jamaica campaign, to the first barrel of Barbadian spirit lifted over a ship's gunwale in the 1650s, was finally and formally severed. The drummers at HMS Collingwood and the black armbands on ships from the North Atlantic to the Far East Station were not melodrama, they were accurate. The Navy had carried the rum ration for over 3 centuries. It had survived the abolition of grog in the American Navy in 1862, survived 2 world wars, survived the transition from sail to steam to diesel to nuclear power. It did not survive the age of the microchip, and in the end, it was not a battle or a disaster or a scandal that ended it. It was the quiet, specific recognition that the machinery of the modern Navy required something from its sailors that the sailing Navy had never asked. Complete sobriety at all times, because the consequences of anything less had grown too catastrophic to absorb. The last tot was poured, the pipe was piped, the rum tubs were stowed away for the final time, and the Royal Navy moved forward into a future that was more capable, more precise, and measurably quieter than anything that had come before. The rum tubs were stowed, the armbands were folded away. The 31st of July became the 1st of August, and the Royal Navy continued its operations with the same competence and discipline it had always maintained. But the question of what had actually ended on Black Tot Day turned out to be more complicated than the Admiralty's written answer had suggested, because while the daily operational ration was finished, a remarkable amount survived it, in ceremony, in memory, in artefacts, in commerce, and in the steady, almost defiant persistence of human nostalgia for a world that the microchip had rendered obsolete. The first and most official survival was the order known as Splice the Mainbrace. It predated the rum ration itself in one sense, a command historically issued after battle or in extreme conditions, authorizing the crew to receive an extra tot in recognition of exceptional service or hardship. After 1970, this order became the one sanctioned channel through which rum could still flow in a Royal Navy context, and it did so on occasions that carried their own considerable weight. When the Queen's Silver Jubilee was celebrated in 1977, the order was given across the fleet. It was given again for the Golden Jubilee in 2002, for the Trafalgar Bicentenary Fleet Review in 2005, and for the Diamond Jubilee in 2012. Each time, sailors who had never known the daily tot found themselves receiving something their grandfathers had taken for granted every morning at 6 bells of the forenoon watch: the command itself, 3 syllables from the age of rope and canvas, referring to a splice in the mainbrace that was among the most arduous repairs a wooden sailing ship required, became a kind of ceremonial time travel, a moment in which the modern Navy briefly inhabited the language and the ritual of its oldest identity. The order was not nostalgia dressed up as tradition. It had the sovereign's authority behind it. It remained technically a living thing. But ceremonies authorized from above are only one kind of survival. The other kind is more personal, less tidy, and considerably harder to extinguish. The men who served aboard ship on Black Tot Day carried the memory of it, with a specificity that institutional history rarely preserves. One duty officer, serving aboard the Polaris submarine Resolution, later described exactly where he was and what the moment felt like when the final pipe sounded and the last tot was measured out. Sailors aboard HMS Fife, then in the Pacific, recorded the smell of rum in an electrical compartment, a detail that tells you something about how thoroughly the ration had saturated shipboard life, how its presence was not merely organizational but atmospheric, embedded in the materials and air of the vessel itself. These accounts, preserved through the Navy Record Society and through the oral histories of veterans organizations, transformed Black Tot Day from a single administrative decision into a constellation of individual moments, each one specific enough to resist the general fading that swallows most institutional history. The artifacts helped. Within the culture of naval collecting, Black Tot Day generated its own category of commemorative material almost immediately. Souvenir packs were assembled containing the practical paper evidence of the ration's last days, a victualling daily state showing the final accounting of rum issued across the fleet, a rum card, a period advertisement for naval rum, a commemorative certificate. These packs circulated among veterans and collectors, treated with the careful preservation that navies traditionally reserve for battle flags and commission plaques. Decades later, the market for them remained active enough that a 2020 auction lot containing such a pack sold for £434. Not a fortune, but significant enough to demonstrate that people were still willing to pay real money for a piece of paper that documented the end of something that had lasted 300 years. The physical object was doing what physical objects always do in the absence of the thing they represent. It was standing in for an experience that could no longer be had, making the past touchable in the only way that remained available. Then there was Puss's rum. In 1979, approximately 9 years after the last tot was poured, a former American Peace Corps officer named Charles Tobias secured the rights to the Admiralty's blended recipe, that carefully guarded combination of Caribbean rums, predominantly from Guyana's Demerara distilleries, that the Navy's victualling board had refined across decades of purchasing and blending, and launched it as a commercial product. The name came from Purser, the naval officer historically responsible for the ship's stores, including the rum, whose title had been contracted by sailors into Pusser, the same way that all naval language contracts itself into something faster and more familiar. Pusser's rum marketed itself without ambiguity. This was the original naval rum, the blend that had gone out in the rum tubs every morning for generations, now available in a bottle behind a bar. The brand made contributions exceeding €250,000 to the Royal Navy's Sailors' Fund, reinforcing the connection between commercial product and institutional heritage. It was a deft and genuinely interesting manoeuvre, because it meant that the Admiralty blend did not die with the ration. It was preserved in a bottle, sold to civilians, and carried the naval story into every pub and liquor shop willing to stock it. The mythology attached to the label, the anchors, the naval insignia, the deliberate invocation of centuries of service, kept the public understanding of naval rum alive in a medium that required no ceremonial occasion and no Admiralty order. Anyone who wanted to drink what the Navy had drunk could now do so on a Tuesday afternoon. What all of this, the splice of the main brace, the veterans' accounts, the auction lots, the Pusser's bottle, accumulated into was something broader than simple preservation. It was the construction of a usable past, a maritime world that had technically ended but refused to dissolve entirely into history. The nostalgia that gathered around the rum ration was part of a larger longing for the whole, vanished culture of the wooden and iron navies, the watches, the mess tables, the particular social geometry of life below decks, the daily rhythms and languages and hierarchies that had organised British naval life from the age of Drake through to the age of the guided missile. Rum was the most tangible, the most sensory, the most immediately revisitable piece of that world. You could not splice an actual main brace in your kitchen, could not recreate the atmosphere of a mess deck in the Pacific, could not smell the particular combination of salt air and engine oil and rope that men of earlier generations would have recognised as home. But you could pour a measure of something that tasted, if not identical to the original, at least continuous with it. The legends did their work alongside the artefacts. The story of Nelson's blood, the tale of a barrel of rum used to preserve an admiral's body on the long voyage back from Trafalgar, a story contested by historians but stubbornly persistent in popular culture, kept naval rum attached to the highest drama that the Age of Sail had produced. The names, Vernon, Blake, Penn, Morgan, the whole cast of characters whose decisions and appetites and ambitions had shaped the rum trade, continued circulating in naval histories and maritime museums, and the branding language of the bottles that lined bar shelves. Popular history had decided that rum was the taste of a particular kind of seafaring adventure, and no parliamentary vote could easily undo that. What survived after the ration was, in the end, a story, precise enough to have dates and veterans and auction lots attached to it, vivid enough to sell bottles, ceremonial enough to require a sovereign's authorization, and open enough at its edges to absorb the nostalgia of anyone who had ever looked at the sea and felt that something had been lost when the Age of Sail gave way to what came after. That story was waiting for something to happen to it, and in the years following Black Tot Day, something did. What happened to that story was, in part, predictable. Nostalgia has a long history of generating commerce, and the commerce that gathered around the memory of naval rum was eventually joined by something more interesting than simple sentimentality. Beginning in the early years of the 21st century, a new generation of distillers began looking at rum with the same intensity that the previous generation had applied to whiskey and gin, not as a category to be dominated by volume, but as a tradition to be interrogated, disaggregated, and rebuilt from first principles. The result was a movement that borrowed the language of wine, the precision of laboratory science, and the marketing instincts of the luxury goods industry, and applied all three to a spirit that the broader drinking public had largely associated with beach resorts and mixing syrups. The industrial version of rum had done the spirit few favours in terms of reputation. Decades of mass production had compressed a genuinely diverse category into a narrow image, something caramel-coloured and sweet, useful for dilution with cola, reliably cheap, unremarkably consistent. The large distilleries that dominated the global market produced at volumes that required efficiency over nuance, blending across regions to achieve a flavour profile that was predictable rather than distinctive. There was nothing dishonest about this. It was simply the logic of scale applied to fermentation and distillation, but it left enormous amounts of the spirit's actual character unexplored and unexpressed, and it left the story of rum's origins, the cane fields, the boiling houses, the Atlantic trade routes, the naval victualling yards, entirely detached from the product in the bottle. The craft distillers who emerged in response to that story saw the detachment as an opportunity. In Brooklyn, a distillery called Cacao Prieto was among the early operations to articulate what a more rigorous approach to rum production might actually mean in practice. The starting point was the molasses itself. Industrial rum production typically uses blackstrap molasses, the spent residue left at the end of sugar processing, which is cheap and available in enormous quantities, but carries a bitterness and a chemical load that the distiller then has to work around. Cacao Prieto rejected that material entirely, sourcing organic first-boil molasses from Dominican sugarcane, the juice-rich syrup drawn from the earliest stage of sugar processing, before repeated boiling strips out most of the subtle compounds. This molasses contained more fermentable sugar, and less of the harsh background flavour that mass production had trained drinkers to accept as simply what rum tasted like. What emerged from the still, when the fermentation was handled carefully and the cuts were made with precision, was something floral and perfumed, recognisable as rum in its basic character, but operating in a register that the industrial product rarely reached. The precision of those cuts was itself a piece of modern technology applied to an ancient problem. Cacao Prieto used a computer-controlled still capable of isolating specific flavour compounds at specific points in the distillation run, separating the spirit into fractions with a granularity that the copper pot stills of the 18th century Caribbean boiling house could never have achieved. There is something historically interesting in this. The same fundamental chemistry that a plantation distiller in 1720 was managing through intuition and experience, smelling the vapour and watching the temperature of the still's neck, was now being tracked by sensors and processed by algorithms. The goal remained what it had always been, to capture the best of what the raw material had to offer and discard what it didn't. Only the instruments had changed. Renegade rum in Grenada took a different but equally rigorous approach, one that pushed the question of origin even further back into the cane itself, working with the concept of terroir, borrowed directly from viticulture and its insistence that the specific soil, elevation and microclimate of a vineyard leave measurable traces in the wine it produces. Renegade coded each of its etude releases with what it called a cane code, a record of the exact growing conditions, soil type, and microenvironment of the sugarcane used for that particular batch. The bottles were then aged in premium French and American oak and bottled at 55% alcohol by volume, high enough to preserve the intensity of the fruit and spice profiles that the distillery's argument depended on. The claim was specific and verifiable, that rum could carry the character of a particular place in the same way that a Burgundy carries the character of a particular hillside, and that this character was worth paying attention to and paying for. At St. George Spirits in Alameda, California, the approach blended the historical and the experimental in a way that characterized the movement at its most intellectually curious. St. George had been operating for decades, rooted in pot-still traditions that traced their lineage to Old World methods, but the distillery had always treated its production floor as a laboratory, as much as a manufacturing space. For its California agricole rum, the distillers applied the kind of winemaker-style raw material selection and controlled fermentation techniques that most rum producers had never considered, adjusting temperature, yeast strains, and fermentation duration with the same deliberateness that a winemaker brings to choosing between native and cultured yeasts. The result was a rum that declared its geographic origin not through branding language alone, but through flavour, something that tasted specifically of California rather than of the anonymous tropics of mass-market expectation. Across all of these operations, what was actually happening was a reframing of the argument about what rum was and where it came from. The new language of the craft movement, provenance, single origin cane, controlled fermentation, cask char experimentation, terroir, was in some sense entirely new, borrowed from other categories and applied to rum with self-conscious sophistication. But in another sense it was simply a return to conditions that had always existed in the spirit's history and had merely been forgotten during the long dominance of industrial production. The molasses that Cacao Prieto sourced from the first boil of Dominican cane was chemically and conceptually close to the raw material that plantation distillers in the 17th century had first fermented in the corroded pots of the Caribbean boiling house. The terroir argument that renegade rum made for Grenada was not far removed from the claims that rum merchants in the 18th century made for the distinct character of Jamaican versus Barbadian versus Demerara spirit. Claims serious enough that the Royal Navy's Victualling Board maintained them as categories in its blending specifications for over a century. What the craft distillers had done was take that old conversation about difference and specificity and give it a contemporary vocabulary, a premium price point. Often $50 or more for a small batch bottle, roughly double what the mass market category commanded, and a degree of scientific documentation that the earlier era lacked the instruments to provide. The Atlantic story that had shaped rum's first 3 centuries, molasses as a valued commodity moving between continents, cane spirit as something whose character depended on where and how it was made, was being rediscovered and reasserted, now expressed through laboratory analysis and marketing copy, rather than through the ledgers of plantation managers and naval victualling officers. The 100 or more craft rum distilleries that had emerged across the United States alone, by the time the movement reached full momentum, were each, in their own way, making the same fundamental argument, that rum deserved the same serious attention that other premium spirits had long commanded, and that the evidence for this seriousness was written into the history of the spirit itself. Every first boil molasses order, every cane code printed on a bottle label, every computer-controlled cut in a Brooklyn distillery was, whether its makers consciously recognized it or not, a form of conversation with the 3 centuries of cane fields and boiling houses and Atlantic voyages that had produced the spirit in the first place. The barrel that had once crossed the ocean on a man-of-war's gun deck was still travelling, still carrying something forward, only now it was moving through the hands of people who had decided to pay very close attention to what was inside it. The barrel on a man-of-war's gun deck was never simply a container. It was a locked oak barrico, typically 30 to 32 gallons, secured against the pitching of a North Atlantic crossing, and the opportunistic thirst of several hundred sailors. From it, at the appointed hour, a boatswain's mate would draw the day's measure and carry it forward to the brass-hooped grog tub on deck, the one that bore the inscription, "The King, God bless him," as though the monarchy itself were present at the dilution. 3 parts water to 1 part spirit. Everything about that ritual, from the engraved tub to the locked cask to the careful ratio, described a system of control applied to a substance that was simultaneously a naval necessity, a unit of currency, a mechanism of discipline, and one of the most economically significant commodities in the Atlantic world. What moved inside the barrel was rum, but what moved around the barrel was everything else. It had started in the cane fields of Barbados, where plantation workers, enslaved men and women whose labour the entire system required, and whose names the system's ledgers rarely preserved, cut sugar for the boiling houses and fed the residual molasses into corroded pots to ferment. The liquid that came out was harsh and practical, and by the 1650s had found its way into the holds of English warships as a pragmatic substitute for beer that had turned and wine that had run out. Jamaica fell to Admiral Penn's fleet in 1655, and with it came access to Caribbean spirit on a scale that changed the provisioning logic of the Royal Navy permanently. What had been a local expedient became a formal institution, a ration with regulations attached, and eventually a blended product manufactured at Deptford Victualling Yard to supply up to 4 million gallons for the fleet, a logistical achievement that transformed a barrel of rum into a moving ledger of imperial supply. The sugar that made the molasses that produced the rum had itself been grown by enslaved labour purchased in part with rum. the triangular trade's brutal arithmetic, in which no single commodity sat outside the system, and no single profit was clean of the others. The barrel that stood on the gun deck was therefore a vessel carrying more than spirit. It carried the weight of plantation management, Atlantic crossing, forced labour, and colonial accounting, all of it condensed into a daily ration that sailors might, if they preferred, take as wages instead of currency, trading their gill for extra food or a favour from a messmate. The barrel as a unit of exchange, as a tax measure under the Spirit Duties Act of 1742, as a customs record gauged by Sykes' hydrometer at the victualling yard. It was always doing more than one kind of work at once. What the barrel also carried was legend. Port Royal had been the clearing-house for all of it, the sugar merchants and the privateers and Henry Morgan's raiders operating at the profitable edge between legitimate commerce and outright plunder, rum flowing through the same warehouses as looted silver and confiscated cane spirit. The sea stories that accumulated around the trade were not incidental to its history. They were part of how the trade was understood and transmitted, passed forward through 2 centuries of naval mythology until the daily ration had acquired an almost ceremonial gravity entirely out of proportion to its practical origins. Admiral Vernon had issued the dilution order in 1740 to solve a problem of drunkenness and efficiency, but what he actually created was grog, a word that spread from the Caribbean fleet to every English-speaking sailor in the world, a proper noun that eventually lost its capital letter and entered the language as something close to permanent. The ration that ended on the 31st of July 1970, when sailors drank their last tot with black armbands and genuine mourning, had accumulated 3 centuries of meaning that no parliamentary committee could fully account for. What survived after the rum ration was not the ration itself, but the story the ration had carried, and that story turned out to be exactly what a new generation of distillers needed. The craft producers who began working seriously with rum in the early 21st century were not simply responding to a market gap, though a market gap existed. They were responding to a historical depth that the industrial era had buried under volume and consistency. When Cacao Preto ages small batch spirit in reclaimed oak barrels, the choice is not decorative. It is a deliberate link in a chain that runs back through the Deptford vatting room and the plantation boiling house and the first corroded copper pot in which some unnamed Barbadian distiller produced something nobody had tasted before. The oak remembers what the oak was always for. The barrel is still doing its old work, still carrying things forward that we do not always have words to name. The rum barrel, then, carried labour and empire and policy and punishment and joy and violence, and the mythology of the sea. It carried all of this across 3 centuries and several continents, and left deposits of meaning in every place it rested. It still sits on a shelf, quieter now, no longer locked against a boatswain's key or rolling in the hold of a ship of the line, but containing, for those who know what to look for, the same long story it has always held. Pressed into the wood, resting in the spirit waiting to be poured,